George Wolfe Crawford, San Antonio, Texas. I'm a fourth-generation Texan. I was attending second year at the University of San Antonio when World War II for the U.S. started. I enlisted on my 20th birthday, which was the next May 7. Now we're up to 1942. But I spent the spring semester taking flying lessons, so when I enlisted as an aviation cadet, I was also a qualified Piper Cub pilot. It's the small, light plane that was the most fun to play of all the many airplanes I have flown as a pilot. Just to give you an example of a Piper Cub, the field was south of San Antonio. We would come in for a landing over a graveyard full of green grass. Air would always sink. So you would come in high, lose altitude. You'd then cross a paved road. The moment you hit that, the air was rising, and you'd bounce up 20 to 30 feet in this light Piper Cub. Then you were back over green grass, and you sank back down to where you were before. But by the time you reached the runway, which was paved, you hit that updraft again and bounced up, and you had to fight to get that light Piper Cub down to the ground. In training, I started out in a Volte vibrator. Then I went to, I've forgotten the exact number, but it was a Boeing training ship. And both of these are single engine. Then I went to advanced training, and I was flying a twin engine light airplane. Now that gets me through 4 of these. Now, I graduate, I become a second lieutenant. I get 10 days at home on vacation. My orders read, I am to be assigned as a pilot to an A-20 group. So I go home, I have 10 days, I get on the train, I get off in Arizona and find I am now a co-pilot on a B-24 4-engine heavy bomber. And those days, the B-24, the B-17 were the heavy bombers. Now that's quite a shock. So at this point, I go into training as a co-pilot on a B-24. Now I go overseas with my crew. I am promoted from a co-pilot to pilot for a very simple reason. The month we arrived in combat, this was February of 1944. At the end of the 30 days, we were the senior crew. Now, every crew coming in had the same sort of experience. They had pilots who had been in, shall we say, 43H, and co-pilots had been in 43I. Now I'm an I. So off we go. And my pilot is now leader. So Ray Morrell decides, and he's decided this back in the training period, that I had to be qualified to fly a B-24 just in case something happened as we tried to bomb a target. Well, I think part of Ray's problem was he got tired of flying and he could rest when I was flying. That we really didn't trust the automatic control, and you certainly didn't use it when you were a lead ship. So in 1944, January, we complete crew training in the United States, pick up our home bomber, B-24, in Long Island, New Jersey, and start south, and we go down to Belém, Brazil, then Fortaleza, and then we fly the Atlantic and follow the African route up to the Mediterranean. There we get orders to report on the other side of Africa. And so we get back in. Off we fly, and we arrive. And now that they're going to tell us whether we're going into the 15th Air Force in Italy or the 14th Air Force in China. Now, at this point, I was pulling for the 14th Air Force because my older brother, Raymond, was also a pilot, a B-24 pilot, and he was flying his bombing missions stationed in China, bombing the Japanese shipping. And I was going to get to rejoin Raymond, I thought. Instead, they sent us into Italy. And so we were assigned to the 376 Bomb Group, 513th Squadron. And in February, I flew my first mission. Our crew flew its first mission. It was to bomb CASSINO across Italy. At this time, the Germans were holed up in the MONTE Cassino and had blocked the advance of the American troops up the Italian peninsula. So we go in. Well, it turns out that our formation is a tail-end Charlie, and they had given a very specific time period in which you could drop. And we came in as a tail-end Charlie, and they said, do not drop. Time period is closed. So we circled and dropped our bombs in the ocean, Mediterranean. Then we hurried up and got in the long line of bombers back to their home bases. Now, the tragedy on the ground was instead of allowing the American troops to charge forward as soon as we stopped bombing, they made them sit for 30 minutes. And the Germans, who had withdrawn from all of those pockets of, shall we say, protection along that cliff, have moved in, and the German troops hadn't been bombed at all, only the positions they had vacated. And when they moved back into those positions, they had full protection and stopped the advance. And so the American effort failed because they did not send the troops in immediately because of that 30 minutes. And it was quite a while before they ever were able to get around behind CASSINO and break that particular line of defense. Now, in the meantime, Ray Morrell, George Crawford, Paul Hoyt, Bill Neal, the 4 officers of our crew, are beginning to fly combat missions. And we are now, shall we say, in 30 days, the senior crew. There were supposed to be 16 crews, 4 officers and 10 enlisted men each. So you don't need imagination to know what happened to those. Now, Ray Morrell is the leader in our squadron. And he was also a second lieutenant. We all were when we went over. But he's immediately promoted to first lieutenant, and the other 3 of us stay second lieutenants. So we began a bombing campaign. Now, we bombed in France, Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Italy, all over Eastern Europe. Then comes a day in which the senior pilots did not want to fly as first pilot. See, they'd come in, they would go through the same training, And Ray, or one of the later comers, would have to fly as first pilot. The new incoming group pilot would fly co-pilot for the first mission. And the senior pilots, Ray, the senior most, were now fed up with flying in the tail end Charlie positions when they knew they should be in those first 4 planes, which were leaders. And so they asked for volunteers. And I volunteered to take the training they would give to become a first pilot, and I would fly as first pilot with the new crews. There were only 2 of us that were stupid enough to do this. Now, what this meant, when Ray flew as first pilot and leader, I was a co-pilot. Now, that was really the safest place to be. Now, I was in the pickoff spots. And believe me, the German Air Force had not lost enough planes to do anything other than hit us repeatedly. Well, the best example of this occurred. I'm checking out a new crew. I'm in that extreme pickoff spot, and we're headed for Vienna. So we go up the Adriatic, through the first of the zones of fighters, the second zone of fighters, third zone of fighters, and there is the target we're to bomb, covered with smoke. Well, we go in as bombing formation of what the planes that haven't been shot down en route, and the flak over the target knocked out 2 of the engines. One fighter's hitting us. It was a flak over the target. Now I cannot keep up with the formation. And so I'm dropping lower, fighting for altitude, trying to get every mile forward I could for altitude. The German fighters came and looked us over. Now, in one of my periods of great sanity, I had ordered our crew to get out of their turrets, to get away from the machine guns, and to not show any opposition. Furthermore, everything you could throw overboard, throw, because we could not maintain altitude. They complied. And so as the German fighters, there were a lone ship coming back all by herself, saw us, they would circle us, and my crew would be waving at them, and they could see the holes in our plane and wouldn't waste another bullet on us. So we go through the 3 zones, we get over the Adriatic. Now the problem is a crash landing on the sea. And again, I gave them instructions, if there's anything left that you haven't thrown overboard, do it now. And I'll tell you, by this time, the crew believed me, and they had stripped that plane. Every gun, every turret that could be dropped was dropped. And we were as light a B-24 as it could possibly be, including beginning to run out of fuel. So we finally get to the point where we would normally turn into our airfield in the toe of Italy. And I make that right-hand turn, and we start across land, and the 3rd engine quits. And it went on. One engine, a B-24, could only do one thing, go down rapidly. You do get a little forward motion. And I got to the place where I can turn into a baseline, downwind landing, and we were falling all the way. We hit the ground 10 yards shy of the runway on this downwind landing. I know because the plane, the wheels, you see, were working. If not, we'd have been dead. They were down and locked. And the wheels made a tremendous, deep trenches as we bounced onto the end of the runway and rolled down. And the runway was, on both sides, was just absolutely crowded with all of the rescue vehicles possible. So that was the end, you see, of that particular mission. When you bombed Brenner Pass, there was only 10,000 feet of difference between their guns and your plane. You were not, they were so high up that it was point blank. And so every time they fired their anti-aircraft cannons, we were hit. So I got home, ready to come back. Now, I did consent to fly on B-24 from San Pancrazio, my base, to Naples to get on the ship to come home. And so, after the invasion from that side of Italy, our total fleet was released. We get out into the Atlantic, convoy, warships all around us. The motors in our troop ship suddenly stop, and the ship just begins to roll. No forward motion. And we watch the escorts, the other ships, disappear to the north. We're in German submarine danger of attack. Fortunately, it didn't occur. 2 days later, they finally got the thing fixed, and we were going full speed ahead, and we were actually able to rejoin the entire group of ships as we landed in New York Harbor. Now, I'm back on terra firma USA. I've got a 10-day leave, and I returned to San Antonio and began courting the young lady who has been my wife now. I'm faced with one of the most terrible decisions I'd ever made. I had sworn I would never set foot in a B-24 again. But she was going to school at Scarrett in Nashville, Tennessee, and to continue courting her, the only assignment I could get anywhere close to Nashville, Tennessee, was at Smyrna Air Force Base as an instructor pilot in, you guessed it, B-24s. And when I finally consented to be an instructor pilot in B-24s, she said, yes, that's what the thing was all about. So I spent 7 months as instructor pilot in B-24s. Then they began to release pilots, and I was in the first group of pilots released. So a call comes from the commander at Smyrna Air Force Base, and all of the instructor pilots apparently had war combat experience. And if we all accepted the wonderful release to go back to being, shall we say, reserve officers, but civilians, then he would not be able to continue training pilots in B-24s. So he began calling us in one at a time, offering us something extra. Well, I was in no hurry to go back to San Antonio because Jeanette would still be in Nashville. And so what I got him to agree to was when the time came, he had enough instructor pilots, he would assign a ship and fly me straight to San Antonio. And that sure beat an overnight ride on a train. So the final day came. The war in the Pacific is closing down, and I get, shall we say, a wonderful ride home in a B-24. Just to give you the rest of the story, the first pilot in this crew was one of those I had trained at Smyrna. And he invited me to be the pilot to make that final landing. And like a sucker, I said yes. So we get on the actual final approach, and he begins to pull every emergency, shall we say, trick the instructor pilot can play on the learning pilot. And boy, he and I were fighting each other. And at the last moment, I greased it in. I mean, it was a smooth landing. And I looked at him and said, I won. That began my career as a civilian reserve officer. And hastily, I returned to the University of Texas to continue my degrees. Jeanette joined me, and we stayed there through my PhD in physics, and we've had a wonderful life since then. When you talk to people about World War II, most of them don't know what you're talking about. They're too young. You know, we've been fighting wars all over the world ever since then, but they haven't exploded to the magnitude of a world war. You know, memories die so quickly. Generations change so rapidly, not only in age, but in what they're interested in and what they're doing. And the best reason for keeping our war histories alive and our children, great-grandchildren knowledgeable is so they won't make the same mistakes.